Naming my baby led to an unexpected family rift. I've always known my parents were opinionated. They're the kind of people who have a way of making their beliefs feel like rules, as if the values they hold are universal truths. They're not bad people, not in any traditional sense. My mom is a strong woman with a warm heart, though she'll rarely show it, preferring to convey her love through actions rather than words. My dad is the quiet type, a man of few words, but the words he does say usually carry weight. He's deliberate, thoughtful, rarely losing his cool. Together, they raised me to be respectful, honest, and grounded, and until recently, I thought our family bond was unshakable. Then I became pregnant. When I first told my parents, they were over the moon. My mom cried. She's not usually emotional, so that was surprising. My dad actually clapped his hands. This little happy movement I don't think I'd seen from him since I was a kid. They were both genuinely thrilled about the idea of becoming grandparents. My husband, Nick, was equally excited. He'd grown up with just his mom and sister, so family wasn't as extensive for him, but he was all in. We started planning and dreaming about our little one together, and it was the happiest I'd felt in years. We spent months preparing for the baby, from decorating the nursery to poring over baby name books and websites. Nick and I considered every possibility. For us, the baby's name was more than a title. It was a symbol of everything we wanted to pass on: love, courage, resilience. And when we finally settled on a name, it felt perfect. We decided to name our baby girl Aria. The name felt beautiful and timeless to me, capturing the hope and light I wanted to give her. Nick loved it too. He said it made him think of music, of beauty, of strength. It was a name that felt like a song, something that would remind her of all the joy we felt waiting for her. So, we decided on Aria. It wasn't up for discussion. We both agreed wholeheartedly. And that's when the trouble began. We announced the name to my parents over dinner. It was supposed to be a special moment, sharing this piece of ourselves with them. But when I said, "We're going to name her Aria," my mom's face fell. She tried to mask her expression, but I could see it, the disappointment, the distaste. My dad cleared his throat and said nothing, which was almost worse than if he'd spoken up right away. I didn't understand at first, but the longer the silence stretched, the more uncomfortable I felt. After dinner, my mom pulled me aside. She didn't outright criticize the name, but she started making suggestions, offering alternatives. "How about something more traditional?" she'd say. "There are so many beautiful names in our family's strong names. Names with history." She suggested names like Grace, Charlotte, even Elizabeth. But none of them felt right. None of them were Aria. When I told her we were set on Aria, her face grew tight. "It just doesn't feel like a family name," she said carefully, choosing her words. I was a little surprised. Aria was as lovely a name as any, in my opinion, and I didn't see why she'd react so strongly. That night, my dad called me. I could tell from his voice that he was upset, which was rare for him. "Are you sure about the name?" he asked. I told him that. Yes. Nick and I were absolutely sure. We'd spent so much time thinking about it, discussing it, and it felt right for us. But my dad wouldn't let it go. He kept hinting that it was disrespectful not to honor our heritage, to break away from names that had been in our family for generations. It was then that I realized this wasn't just about the name, it was about identity, tradition, and the values my parents held so close. The names my family had used for generations were classic, names that echoed through our ancestry, names that were sturdy and familiar. My dad's insistence felt almost like he was saying that if I chose Aria, I'd be choosing to separate myself from my roots. I tried to explain how much the name meant to me, how it symbolized everything Nick and I wanted for our daughter. But he wouldn't budge. In the days that followed, the tension only grew worse. My parents would send me texts with more name suggestions, lists of options, some with family connections, others with more traditional leanings. My mom would call me to check in, but I knew she was really hoping I'd say we'd changed our minds. Each call left me feeling more alienated, like they couldn't see me or my wishes, only their own desire for control. It became impossible to talk about anything else with them. One evening, my mom showed up unannounced. She sat me down and, in a voice I recognized from my childhood, the one she'd used when she wanted her way, told me that Aria just isn't fitting for our family. She explained how important it was to her to see a name that felt connected to our roots. She reminded me of all the strong women in our family, their sacrifices, and how they'd passed down their legacy through each generation. "Don't you want her to feel like part of that legacy?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. It was then that something inside me snapped. I told her that she was pushing too hard, that she wasn't respecting my choice. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel the anger bubbling up. I told her how Nick and I had spent hours thinking about the name, how it meant something to us, how it wasn't about rebelling or breaking tradition, it was about creating something new, something for our family. But she didn't understand. To her, it felt like I was rejecting everything she valued, everything she'd tried to instill in me. The next morning, my dad called, and I could tell he was upset, even though he tried to hide it. He accused me of not respecting my heritage, of ignoring the values they'd raised me with. "Do you really want to raise her without a connection to her history?" he asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. I tried to explain, but he cut me off, saying that I was making a mistake, that I was letting modern ideas cloud my judgment. From that point on, things only got worse. My parents began to argue among themselves, each taking a different stance. My mom was more resigned, starting to accept that maybe I wasn't going to change my mind. But my dad became even more insistent, pressing her to help him talk sense into me. I'd overhear them fighting whenever I visited. My dad insisting that I was losing touch with my roots. My mom telling him to let it go. They'd been married for 35 years, and as long as I'd known them, they'd always been united. They'd always presented a strong, united front. But now, for the first time, they were fractured, divided by something as small as a name. I started to feel guilty, wondering if maybe I was being selfish, if maybe I should give in just to keep the peace. But every time I thought about changing the name, about giving up the idea of Arya, it felt wrong, like I'd be sacrificing a piece of myself, a piece of the life Nick and I wanted for our daughter. The closer my due date got, the more I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me, like a dark cloud hanging over what should have been one of the happiest times in my life. I avoided visiting, making excuses to keep the peace. But I couldn't escape the constant calls, the texts, the guilt they heaped on me. My parents' once warm home felt cold, filled with a tension that I couldn't break through. In the end, I stood my ground. Arya was born on a crisp September morning, and when I looked into her tiny face, I felt a surge of love so powerful it nearly knocked me off my feet. She was Arya, her name fit her perfectly. I called my parents from the hospital, hoping that they'd be able to set aside their disappointment, to be happy for us, for her. My mom was quiet, her voice subdued. My dad barely spoke. When we brought her home, I tried to bring my parents into her life, inviting them to visit, to meet her, to share in the joy. But there was a distance there, a rift that I couldn't bridge. They came, but they barely acknowledged her name, calling her the baby, or simply refusing to use her name at all. I knew then that our family had changed, that the bonds we'd once shared had been stretched thin, nearly to the breaking point. Naming my daughter Arya was a choice that meant everything to me, a symbol of the life I wanted to build with Nick. But in choosing her name, I lost something, too, a sense of the family unity I'd always taken for granted, a certainty that my parents would always stand by me. I don't regret my choice, but I've come to realize that family and loyalty aren't as straightforward as I once believed. Sometimes, holding on to what matters to you means letting go of what used to be. And as I look at my daughter, at her tiny, perfect face, I know that she's worth it. Arya is worth every sacrifice, every difficult decision. And though our family may never be the same, I'll carry forward, building a life for her that's rooted in love, even if it's a love my parents can't yet understand.